Okay, sorry for that delay, but I think we're ready to roll. All right, so welcome to dot point number 3, in which we're going to be looking at any minute now. Here we go, the formation of the Sangha. So this is our third dot point, and the syllabus asks us to consider its formation within the first 5 years. So this is during the life of the Buddha, from its early inception to when it's starting to grow and it's starting to formalize or organize itself more formally. So let's begin. So the Sangha is actually considered to be one of the 3 jewels of Buddhism. And if you look at sort of Buddhist iconography, you might realize that there's this sort of recurring motif, which is the Triratna, which is a symbol that's a type of like a trident, and it upholds, 3 literal jewels. So the jewels of Buddhism are considered to be the most ideal the greatest ideals of the religion, and are considered to be at its very central heart. They're referred to as jewels, as you can imagine, for obvious reasons. Jewels are beautiful and yet, sometimes indestructible, and, have a long life. And for this reason, this sort of symbolism is often used. But what are the 3 jewels? What are the 3 core tenets that make up Buddhism or are at the core of Buddhism? Well, let's get to them. Number 1, as you might expect, it is, of course, the Buddha, so his life and his example. Number 2, anyone? The Dharma, so the teachings of the Buddha, the things that he explains after his accession as the Awakened One on how to achieve enlightenment. And then number 3, as we just said, is the Sangha. But what is the Sangha? Well, it's essentially the religious community. Now, these 3 things, basically, these 3 jewels interact together, and they're sort of meant to be interdependent on each other. So when the Buddha reached enlightenment, he was able to teach the Dharma. The Dharma encourages communal living to according to its discipline and its code in order to achieve enlightenment. Same way, the Buddha's example of enlightenment encourages people to live together and follow his life example, which helps them, understand the Dharma, which helps them achieve enlightenment. So it's a sort of interaction between these 3 things. And when one becomes ordained as Buddhist or as a Buddhist monk, they will often say, I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, and I take refuge in the Sangha. All right, but let's get back to it. Now, I just told you that the Sangha means community, right? Religious community. But for our purposes, I need to sort of narrow this definition a bit more, because at times when you look at literature, in particular literature that's sort of produced in the West, you'll see the Sangha as a word which is used to talk about like the religious community of Buddhists in a very general sense. So all Buddhists together living make up the religious community, make up the Sangha. But we actually need to narrow that a little bit further, because for our purposes, when we're talking about the Sangha, we're talking about ordained monks and nuns. So we're actually looking at the Sangha more in opposition to the lay community. Now, when I say lay community, L-A-Y, I'm talking about people who might, consider themselves as Buddhists, but who haven't taken the steps to be formally ordained as monks or nuns or live in a monastic tradition. So there are sort of 2 types of believers here, and the Sangha is part of the formal monastic community, okay? That's very important to remember. At times, you might also see a differentiation between female Sangha and male Sangha. So Bhikkhu for male, meaning monk, and Bhikkhuni, which is the female, so for nuns. You might also see a further differentiation, which is the Ariya Sangha, which is sorry guys, my apologies. The Ariya Sangha, which is the Sangha of those which are considered to be like on a different or higher level of enlightenment or awakening. So when we talk about Buddhism, we're not talking about merely, the everyday person and then the awakened one, the Buddha, there are considered to be different stages towards enlightenment. And those of the Arya Sangha sort of make up the followers of Buddha, which are considered to be on the road to enlightenment and have sort of reached a different understanding of the Dharma and the Buddhist teachings. Okay, now, when does the Sangha actually begin? Well, who were the Buddha's, first followers? His first, monks, so to speak. Well, 5 points to you, to Gryffindor, if you actually guess the ascetics. If you remember from last lesson, the ascetics which Buddha had, which originally rejected the Buddha, become his first disciples. So they sort of hear his sermon, achieve a level of awakening, and then follow him and become his first official disciples. Now, part of their mission is to actually go forth and spread the Dharma out of their own compassion for the good of the rest of mankind. They travel across northern India at the beginning, following west, in order to teach the Dharma and help people reach enlightenment. Now, while this is essentially the first Sangha, it's not really a religious community because you have, 5 enlightened ones and the Buddha himself. And, there isn't really much sense of a communal living, especially because all of the disciples have sort of reached the state of awakeness, and therefore there's no real need to provide rules and there's a lot of flexibility. But as the community grows and as more and more people commit themselves to following the Dharma or becoming the Buddha's disciple through his travels and through their, missionary work, we start to see, a greater sense of community because there's a need for more structure, more formalization to cope with how much people there are. All right. Now, if you have a look in the background, you might see some friendly deer. And this is because when Buddha was giving this first sermon, he actually is said to have preached in a deer park. Now, preaching and living in parks actually becomes quite common for the Sangha. So the Sangha develops its sort of own kind of community that's independent yet tied in with the outside world. Now, this starts when, an actual fact of Indian life, at least in northern India, was that for a few months out of the year, you can't travel. You can't walk barefoot from town to town. You actually have to settle because of monsoon season. It rains and it's difficult to make any sort of travel for a few months of the year. So what you're seeing right here on the right is actually the remains of one of the huts of the second park, which was donated to the Buddha, which is the Jetavana Park. So kings and leaders that sort of heard the Buddha and heard his teachings donated, and this sort of became a tradition, donated these parks that the Sangha would, live in for months at a time. And originally they would sort of just live in the wilderness, but eventually, they were given these huts to occupy. And once you have a larger group of people that are sort of stationary for a few months of the time, you start to see a greater need for rules and organization away from the sort of like general flexibility that was allowed in the early stages when the community was still small. All right, so as it grows and as it becomes a formalized community that sort of sits in one place for a while and is quite large, we start to see a greater emphasis on rules, organization, and structure. Okay, all right, now the next interesting thing. So during one of these stages during Buddhist travels, as he is gathering these followers, I just want to touch on this. So this sort of life that the Buddha was living in these sort of parks really represents his philosophy of the Dharma of the Middle Way, because yes, they are both meant to be removed from the lay community. Part of the Dharma is to, be an island onto oneself. So to sort of retrieve into isolation, to live a life, a monastic life, a life of poverty and a life of discipline. And that requires you, to live outside your life, live outside your job, outside of your role in your family and consider yourself dependent and away from that world. And the Sangha develops as a community that is both away from the world yet a part of it. So not like the ascetics that sort of retreated into the wilderness, or the Jains that sort of lived naked in the forest completely alone. The Sangha was both isolated but yet tied to the lay community. And I think this is most best represented in the alms bowl. So monks are, they are forced as part of their discipline to beg for food, and the lay offer food as well. So they're both sort of connected in this, exchange towards enlightenment, and both benefit from it. But there's a relationship between them. It's sort of halfway, or the middle way, between complete isolation and sort of complete integration. So it's like this middle path. All right, but let's get to the next interesting dot point. So Mahapajapati, the Buddha's aunt. So I don't know how many of you know this, but the Buddha's mother actually died at within 7 days of his birth. And so for the most part of his life, he was actually raised by his aunt, his mother's sister, who actually ended up marrying his father, the king. And she actually goes at one point to become his follower. So she goes to seek his admission into the Sangha. Now, she asks 3 times, and by the way, she's not alone. She has 500 other women who wish to join the Buddha on his sort of pilgrimage and on his sort of missionary quest, but they are rejected 3 times. But, his aunt sort of doesn't stand for that, and, still shaves her head along with her fellow women, still dons the robes of a monk, and follows him barefoot on his travels between towns. Now, what ends up happening is that she ends up becoming ordained because Ananda, which is the Buddha's cousin, and who's sort of considered to be one of his most, educated disciples, because he is sort of Buddha's attendant, or he's not his servant, but his attendant. And he's famous for sort of being able to almost completely memorize the entire Dharma. He actually asks and intercedes on part of the women. So he says, "Oh Lord, are women capable of realizing the various stages of sainthood as nuns?" And then the Buddha replies, "They are, Ananda." And then, Ananda says, "If that is so, Lord, then it would be good if women could be ordained as nuns." So he sort of says, well, if that's true, then why can they not be ordained? Well, Buddha's reply to this is, if Ananda, my aunt would accept the 8 conditions, it would be regarded that she has been ordained already as a nun. So Buddha relents and accepts these women, including his aunt, who becomes the first female adherent, into his Sangha, into his community of followers. But this is interesting, the 8 conditions. What are these 8 conditions? Well, we'll get back to that in a second, but I just want to go and talk about the conditions of living for monks and nuns. So, okay. The Vinaya Pitaka is actually an interesting Buddhist scripture which concerns itself primarily with rules for monastic living. Now, it was an oral tradition. It was said to be passed on from the Buddha to his disciples during his lifetime, and then it was eventually meant to be written down. But as we have sort of guessed in previous lectures, oral tradition, when things start off as being passed on orally and then become formally written down, there are sometimes disagreements to their authenticity, or, there are sometimes disagreements to what is included or what shouldn't be included. So not everyone agrees with what's in the Vinaya Pitaka, or what makes up some of the rules for monastic discipline living. But essentially, tradition states that initially there was no real need for rules, especially because okay, hopefully I can edit that out. Okay, essentially because the original disciples of the Buddha reached like a level of enlightenment. But when they started to take on more, followers that were not arahants or who had not reached a level of, elevated spirituality yet, there started to be a greater need for regulation and for law. So these texts or these oral rules started to be formed allegedly during the life of the Buddha. Now, there are sort of traditions that come about, concerning like how they emerged. The first one was allegedly about restrictions on sex because one of the monks, their family sort of were upset that they would have no heirs now because the monk decided to be ordained and follow the Buddha, so they forced him to impregnate his wife. And then, the Buddha had to sort of lay claim that this was something that was unacceptable, could not be done. Mind you, the husband, the wife, and the child ended up becoming ordained and reaching a level of awakenedness. But yes, so these are all the rules, that you have to shave your head, that you have to don the monk's or robe, that you can only eat till noon, and that food can only be begged for, so on and so forth. They're meant to be quite a few rules, and they get quite complicated and quite strict in terms of how to live in this community. Now, then what are the 8 additional rules for women? Well, the 8 Garudamas translates to the heavy rules. Now, it's important to acknowledge, and we'll talk more about this in class, that these rules are sort of controversial and contested. Some doubt their authenticity, some think they're outdated. There are a whole different variety of things that we're going to be talking about in relation to these rules, but essentially there are 8 additional rules that women must accept before or as a condition to becoming ordained. So, for example, I'm just going to give you one of those. So it says, number 1, a nun who has been ordained even for 100 years must greet respectfully, rise up from her seat, salute with joined palms, do proper homage to a monk ordained by that day. So these are considered to be the rules that are the conditional rules for women if they want to become part of the Sangha. So while they are and they exist as part of the Sangha, they also have sort of limitations or additional laws that they have to prescribe by in order to become functioning members of that community. Now, we talked last time how the Sangha was a really revolutionary thing. I mean, it didn't talk about class or, the caste system, and it allowed women to participate. And these are all quite revolutionary things for this time period. But as you can see here, there are still some sort of things that are carried on from earlier traditions and from the culture of, this century in India. And we'll be discussing more about that in class, but hopefully you've been reading along. Now you know what the Sangha is, and you know how some of the sacred texts and laws associated with it, and we will talk more about it in class. All right, hopefully you've been taking notes. I will see you next lesson.